My name is William Hedrick, and this is my presentation for the syllabus for history under Dr. Van Cleve. Um, to begin with, I believe that, the course is named North American History, but if we're going to speak of North American history, then I think it's imperative that we discuss all of North America, includes Mexico and Canada, which seems to be a pretty extensive project to cover. I think what we mean by North American history is the history of the United States. And as such, we're looking at now we're getting close to 400, over 400 years of our history, or almost 400 years of our history. It's just too much to cover. I think to begin with, what we have to do is we need to be very judicious about what we cover before the United States becomes a union. And as such, I think that I would start by having a unit that's basically pre-union. And one of the things I'd like to do is to separate into two narratives, if you will, that are somewhat conflicting. So I would begin with talking about the Enlightenment and contrasting that with the religious wars of the period. Why the Enlightenment was important, why it was so important to Jefferson and to the founding fathers, and why religion played in such an important role. I would include with the next chapter getting into just colonization and the triangle trade and how this era, the era of exploration, was followed up by the colonialism that got us into the situation we are. And then get into discussing specifically the British colonies, how the British colonies in the 7 Year War impacted the taxation that ultimately was used as a reason to start the revolution, and to discuss the planetary economy and the amount of debt that the founding fathers were into prior to the revolution, and some of the arguments within the different schools of the revolution, discussing the different reasons for the revolution. I think we really need to spend more time being honest about why we got into the revolution as opposed to just repeating dogma. With that covered, I think we need to basically begin speaking about the history of the United States, which really starts with the Revolution, but not from a military history standpoint. I think we need to discuss more about how we got into it, what happened, and really emphasize the part. We have a tendency to say that the Cornwallis was handed over a sword to Washington at Yorktown, and that was that, and it simply wasn't. It was very much in doubt. So certainly talk about the Articles of Confederation, get into an extensive period talking about the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and the dialogue that went into there. And then ending that up with the problems between Jefferson and Hamilton, and the Great Compromise between the two, and kind of finish that up. I'd like to cover these in kind of thematic periods, if you will, thematic eras. Getting into Unit 3, talking about Lewis and Clark and the expansion of the continent, of why the expansion of the continent is so important to the suffrage and voting rights and owning property. Discussing the market revolution, how we developed corporations with the Erie Canal, how just that early revolution, the early republic, the Great Awakening, and how we had this period in the antebellum period that was very shifting values, and we were still polarizing. We're going, the North is becoming more industrialized, while the South is becoming more agrarian. We're drifting apart, the nullification process. So basically, still following the track of how our nation's trajectory is tied up with cotton and with slavery and with this battle between states' rights and federalism. I think that continue to go discussing Jacksonian democracy, spending some time on Texas, how important Texas is in the Missouri Compromise, and once again the expansion of slavery and expressing how yes, it is very much about states' rights, but states' rights is synonymous with the expansion of slavery and the states' right to have slaves. Um, and I would follow that up and finish that up with discussing the election of 1854, certainly right before that, the Mexican-American War, but just how we basically fell apart at the seams by the Civil War. And I would finish up this section discussing the Civil War and end it the first semester at the Civil War without getting into the Reconstruction. I think that we go into a new era with Reconstruction, and once again using this polarization, using Reconstruction against the Industrial Revolution, the progressivism against the robber barons, the anti-imperialism at the same time. We've got our progressive presidents of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Following that, once again with the 20-year period with Wilsonian industrialism, the World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, the Dawes Act, the bond market, leading up, and how it's really one great war and not actually it's one great war separated by an armistice instead of two wars. Having going into the next decade of the 40s with the Depression stock market, or I'm sorry, the 30s with the Depression, the stock market, the 40s with World War II, the 50s with Eisenhower, Truman and Eisenhower, the changing of the guard, 20 years of democratic rules is, and the Republicans rising like a phoenix with McCarthyism and the Cold War. Getting into the 60s and the polarization that we're starting to see with Kennedy and LBJ and the Vietnam War, the 70s with globalization, losing our unions, losing our jobs, the 80s, the 90s with neoconservatism and the rise of this new conservative libertarian fundamentalist caucus. And finishing up right about there, because I really don't believe that when you get too close to the modern times, you're not dealing with history but current events that's not quite resolved yet. So while I certainly think we need to talk about Watergate, I would question how much we can really discuss about terrorism at this point. It's still very much a very fluid issue. So that would be my suggestion. I think if I was going to have anybody read anything, I would have them reread The Grapes of Wrath. While it's a fiction, it speaks very strongly to how important it was for the New Deal to take place, and how everything after the New Deal was a little bit of a different story. So I believe that the manner in which we allowed our countrymen to become the other, I think is something that really sticks strong with me. So thank you. I appreciate it. I hope this is the type of presentation that I was supposed to give, and have a good evening.